holidays provide an annual testing ground for spiritual maturity. It's easy to be blissful while sitting on the beach, hiking by yourself in the woods, or pausing to savor a sunset. But as the saying goes, our family can push our buttons because our family members are the ones who sewed on our buttons in the first place. Our various complexes and neuroses are often forged in our childhood family systems, and they can easily be triggered by returning to our families of origin or by people who are similar to those in our families of origin. But in our highly mobile world, it's also increasingly possible to spend the majority of one's time with people who share your general worldview. So returning home for the holidays can be a culture shock. Or it may be the case that your family is still your tribe, who supports you and with whom you strongly identify. In either case, our nation has people, I suspect, on either side of whatever divide who aren't part of your tribe. And our nation is facing problems on multiple fronts right now that can easily divide and do easily divide our country into factions. The new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, the epidemic of mass shootings and multiple interpretations of the Second Amendment, climate change deniers, and the Paris Climate Summit. We can't even agree as a nation on happy holidays versus Merry Christmas. So this morning, I'd like to share with you some insights from Chris Stedman. He's an interfaith activist and the executive director of the Yale Humanist community at Yale University. Some insights about trying to navigate these divisive factions in our country. In his mid-20s, Stedman published a memoir titled Faitheist. How many of you have heard the term Faitheist before? It was new to me as well. Prior to encountering Stedman's book, again, I never encouraged that word. Imagine the word faith and the word atheist combined into Faitheist. And when Stedman first heard that word hurled at him, it was not intended as a compliment. He was attending a public forum on how atheists and agnostics and other non-theistic, non-religious people should approach religion. And when he tried to make a point, because he perceived that those on the panel had a consistently negative, unhopeful approach, or a very angry approach of how someone non-religious should approach religion. So he tried to make a point about how religion had helped sustain the work of peace and justice figures like Mahatma Gandhi and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And someone he had never met quickly retorted, "Oh, I get it. You're one of those atheists. You're not a real atheist. We've got a name for people like you, Faitheist." Which sounds also a little bit like fake atheist. You can probably hear that in there. So as this young, burgeoning secular humanist, these were stinging words that reminded Stedman of all the people who had told him in his childhood that he couldn't be and was not a real Christian because he was gay. The late astronomer, cosmologist, and public intellectual Carl Sagan wrote a book titled The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. To share just one passage from that book, Sagan writes, "The chief deficiency that I see in the skeptical movement is its polarization, us versus them. The sense that we have a monopoly on the truth, that those other people who believe in all those stupid doctrines are morons, and if you're sensible, you'll listen to us, and if not, to hell with you." Not literally, of course, but this is non-constructive, Sagan wrote. It does not get our message across. Stedman writes that as a young person who had been alienated from traditional religion, he sought out secular humanism, hoping to find a community bound by ethical and humanitarian ideals. Instead, he found himself feeling isolated and sorely discouraged that when he had thought he might find a community, a place where he might fit in. I'll confess, however, that when confronted with the ways that fundamentalist religions continue to inspire racism and sexism and homophobia around the world, as well as to embolden climate change deniers and in extreme cases inspire terrorist attacks, there is part of me that can understand the rationale between that ancient rationalist dream of the Enlightenment that humanity will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Think about that. Humanity will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. I'll remind you that I'm a minister and not a priest. But Stedman challenges us to consider that such violent, reactionary approaches tend to sow the seeds of their own defeat by turning off even would-be supporters. And although Chris Stedman is not a Unitarian Universalist, it is not surprising that Beacon Press, our own UU publishing house, published his book. Unitarian Universalism is a big tent religion. We draw explicitly from 6 diverse sources which are listed on the back of each week's order of service. Fascinatingly, both Christian theism, source 4, and secular humanism, source 5, are still only 2 of our 6 sources. Together, Christianity and humanism only comprise 1/3 of the big tent that is Unitarian Universalism. The other 2/3 include direct experience, the words and deeds of social activists, wisdom of the world's religions, and earth-centered traditions. And although Stedman remains convinced of his atheistic worldview, his humanism has led him to be increasingly involved in interfaith circles, as well as to come to see that criticism of the term Faitheist as a compliment. He's become increasingly convinced that humanists need to be part of interfaith conversations if interfaith conversations are really going to move forward to bring what our world needs. But one of Stedman's biggest critics is the scientist and one of the most popular atheist bloggers on the internet, P.Z. Myers, who promotes a very hard-edged approach to religion. Not all religion, not just fundamentalism. Myers writes, to give you just one flavor of what he has written at length, he says, "I say screw the polite words and careful rhetoric. It's time for scientists to break out the steel-toed boots and the brass knuckles and get out there and hammer on the lunatics and the idiots." Stedman, in contrast, believes in a different way forward to building a better world. He writes, "I want to live in a world where love is more commonplace, and I think the way to get there is through love and compassion and generosity." And that starts by a more compassionate engagement with those with whom one differs. Stedman continues with some wisdom that is highly applicable to Unitarian Universalism and this big tent that we seek to grow in amidst all our diversity. He writes that religious pluralism is neither coexistence nor consensus. So religious pluralism is neither just mere coexistence, just being in the same room together. Neither is it necessarily consensus, all coming to agree on something. He says religious pluralism is the active engagement of religious diversity to a constructive end. The active engagement of religious diversity to a constructive end. Diversity is a mere descriptive fact of there being many instead of one. Pluralism, which is what we seek, you'll actually see that word, the pluralism that ennobles us, in the back of your order of service. Pluralism is an achievement. It's not a mere descriptive fact, and it has at least 3 essential components. Respect for individual religious or non-religious identity, mutually inspiring relationships, and common action for the common good. That vision is strongly akin to what we seek to achieve here at UUCF, a place where every person's inherent worth and dignity is respected. That's Stedman's respect for individual religious or non-religious identity. A place where we can come together to support and learn from one another. That's Stedman's mutually inspiring relationships. And a place in which we join together to work for more peace and justice in the world. That's Stedman's common action for the common good. Stedman writes that in his youth, being right held ultimacy. He said, I valued precision and accuracy. I thought I was doing people a favor by correcting them. He says, now I strive to lead with listening instead of lecturing. Or to again quote Carl Sagan, this time from his book Cosmos, on the need to respect all human life from, no matter their point of view, from a secular humanist perspective. He writes, every one of us is, in the cosmic perspective, precious. If a human disagrees with you, let him or her live in 100 billion galaxies. In 100 billion galaxies, you will not find another. In a similar spirit, a few weeks ago, I shared with you a short poem by the late Israeli poet Yehud Amichai, titled, The Place Where You Are Right. I invite you to hear it once more. Amichai writes, from the place where you are right, from the place where you are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, like a plow, and a whisper is heard where the ruined house once stood. I encourage you in the coming days and weeks as we approach winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, to experiment with sharing, not first or only from the place where you feel like you are right, but instead to take the risk of sharing the stories of your doubts and your loves, and then listening to the others' stories about their doubts and what they love. In Stedman's experience, an authentic, robust, engaged religious pluralism as opposed to a mere descriptive fact of diversity is achieved primarily through sharing personal stories. And I'll conclude with just one example from his memoir. He writes, as an atheist and as a humanist seeking to make the world a better place, one of the places he was working was in a assisted living home. And that one day a resident named Martin, who he had been assigned to, asked him to read a book. Now, he'd read a book many times for Martin, but this time Martin pulled off of his shelf a worn book that clearly was well-loved and well-read. It was a prayer book. It was Martin's prayer book. Stedman was hesitant, and he knew he didn't have to do this. He could just call in someone else, another of the volunteers, to read this book. But as he began to read, he saw Martin visibly relax in a way he had never seen before, and he could see the gratitude on Martin's face. Stedman writes, an unexpected feeling overtook me as well. Relief. I had participated in a religious act with Marvin, and I felt neither a strong desire to return to my Christian roots, nor a disdain for his beliefs, as I so often had when seeing any form of religious expression since I left Christianity. In a way, reading the prayer felt like a conversion experience. It was profoundly different than simply doing my job. It was entirely unlike previous times when I had read to Marvin. I could tell by the way that he sat on the bed instead of pacing the room as he usually did, that the prayer meant something very profound to him. And that meant something very profound to me. I realized that though I couldn't decipher why the prayer was so important to him, it was important to him, and it touched him in a profound way. And because I shared in this significant element of his life, our relationship became much more honest and real. Here at UUCF, we have an incredible wealth of religious diversity. Multiple times each month, we have an atheist, humanist, agnostic discussion group. We have a Buddhist fellowship. We have a progressive Christian fellowship. We have an earth-centered spirituality group and pagan gatherings. Likely there are people that are in the pews beside you who, we sort of have, you could kind of map Venn diagrams, right, of where people are on the six sources. And so I invite you to consider, especially if you haven't before, Peter Rollins is a speaker who has something he calls reverse evangelism that he practices, that he makes a practice of just a few times a year going to a religious community or going to a religious service that isn't part of his tradition, and just allowing him, opening his heart and mind to just converting him to seeing why this is meaningful to these people, even if it's not for him. I invite you to share your doubts, not to be careful about a skeptical approach, right? Don't engage someone by pestering them about their doubts or your doubts about their position, right? Just share your doubts, the things you doubt about for yourself, and share your loves, and just invite them to share a little bit about what they doubt and what they love about their practices and their tradition. I sometimes say that, and that's also a part of the service that we seek to hear, which is a UU service. It's a robust, pluralistic service. And I sometimes invite people to say, it may well be that 100% of every service we do here resonates with you. For some of you, though, I know maybe 80% of a service, or 90%, or maybe 60%. Most of you, I think it's even probably most of the time higher than that. But as I had a mentor one time ask us as a group, he said, now, what part, it was a trick question, but he said, what part of the worship didn't resonate with you this evening? And people sort of mentioned some stuff, and he said, I invite you to consider that it's not just about you, Narcissus. It's not just about you. He's saying, if 70%, 80%, 90% of worship works for you, celebrate that and know that that other piece might be the most important part for another person. So I invite you to consider sharing your doubts, sharing your loves. As you continue to reflect on what that might look like for you, I invite you to rise in body or spirit, to turn in your teal hymnals to hymn 1012, When I Am Frightened. We'll sing together.